Hello everyone, I hope you all have been able to stay sane as we wrap up the semester. My name is Alejandro, and for my project I will be analyzing the often underappreciated influence of Japan's international media empire on American pop culture. In particular, I will be examining how the anime Afro Samurai is the perfect representation of how Japanese media has been able to penetrate specific segments of American culture, such as hip-hop and urban America. So to start off, I'm just going to explain some basic historical context surrounding Japan. So, after the Allies emerged victorious over the Axis powers to bring an end to the Second World War, the United States opted to occupy Japan from 1945 to 1952. The goal of this occupation was to help ensure the reconstruction of Japan would not result in a new national identity that would once again threaten the quote-unquote free world. During such a tumultuous time in Japan's history, the significance of these 7 years cannot be understated when trying to understand the complexities of modern Japanese society. While there is no denying that the American presence in Japan now extends far beyond the policies enacted by the government 75 years ago, the relationship between these two countries is commonly misconstrued as a one-way relationship. It is my belief that Americans simply view Japan as a byproduct of as the spread of American democracy and do not truly appreciate the culture's impact on American pop culture. So, in order to understand what made Afro Samurai so special, I first had to understand how the connection between two such vastly different cultures formed. And so, to start my research, I decided I needed to define what exactly urban America was, because that can be a fairly large topic. So, I found a great quote from Stanford saying that over 75% of households in the United States live in metropolitan areas. But unsurprisingly, black households were 31 percentage points more likely than a white household to live in the poorest inner city areas. So based on this, I concluded that urban America is largely associated with African American and immigrant lifestyles. Many of these families operate at significantly lower incomes that force them to focus on securing necessities like food, water, and shelter over everything else. Naturally, many of these individuals view themselves as underdogs in a society that wants nothing to do with them. So it was from here that I began to start to see some of the similarities that brought the cultures together. And so with kind of the first wave of anime to hit America was things like DBZ, and those anime lured children in with over-the-top emotional fights, but what really carried them and gave them staying power was the unique ability of the American audience to be able to resonate with these characters in ways unintended by Japanese authors. And I think the biggest factor in this was sort of the underdog mentality given to a lot of characters in anime, and how a lot of African Americans can resonate with that in their own personal lives. And a lot of anime, the main character, basically every episode, every season, his goal typically is to defeat some enemy in battle that's basically an obstacle in his life. And no matter what, there's always a new obstacle at the end of the road. And so I think this can be metaphorically kind of attributed to African American society, where they feel as outcasts and that society has left them behind, and that it's up to them to better themselves and face the challenges that they face every day. And there's also the idea of kind of the community in Black culture, and how since they've been left behind, it's up to them and their community to band together in order to help themselves. And I kind of attribute this to kind of the small cliques you see in anime, where the main character will have a very small circle that he values over everyone else, and that's his family, and he will do anything to protect them, whether that's breaking the law or whatever means necessary. And so I just found this super interesting, because a lot of the connections were not intended by Japanese creators, and I think this kind of shows how when watching anime from a different culture, they don't understand some of the original references and cameos in the anime, but it lets them develop a whole new line of thought and a way to resonate with characters. And so an interesting quote I found was that Son Goku starts off as a kid who begins his martial arts training and goes off on a quest for the 7 Dragon Balls that can unleash a dragon that can grant him his magic wish. And so that voyage may represent the journey of enlightenment for some, but for RZA, Dragon Ball Z also represents the journey of the black man in America. The RZA is a legendary rapper and producer of the Wu-Tang Clan, and he's also important to Afro Samurai, and we'll be talking about him later. And so, I guess to start, what is Afro Samurai? So, Afro Samurai is a manga series written and illustrated by Takashi Okazaki, I believe that's how you pronounce it. And it was inspired by his love of hip-hop and American music. And so a quote straight from the author is, "I've been hooked on African American music like hip-hop and soul since I was a teenager. And that's when I started doodling African American cartoon characters. Then I threw in elements of samurai, which would also have been my fascination. And eventually the character of Afro Samurai was created." So Afro Samurai was immediately a massive success for of the time, and it quickly led to an anime adaptation for the manga. And so early in pre-production, the creator Takashi basically realized the chance he had to bring the hip hop aesthetic he always dreamed of to life on the big screen. And so in pre-production, he made the suggestion that instead of recording in Japanese, they actually bring in English voice actors and record it in English, and also bring in the RZA as a soundtrack producer to help bring the hip hop aesthetic alive. And so they contracted Studio Gonzo and brought Samuel Jackson. The RZA, I believe they brought them to Japan, and that's where it started. And so this is super unusual for the time because, as far as I'm concerned, most anime coming out of Japan is always recorded in English, and usually you'd get a sub first. Just the fact that it was dubbed in English originally for the first release is something super big, and I think super culturally important for anime in general and expanding just beyond Japan. And so, just a basic plot summary of Afro Samurai. So, the owner of the #1 headband is considered the strongest man in the world, akin to a god, and he lives on top of a mountain which he cannot leave for his whole life. And the only man who can challenge the holder of the #1 headband is the owner of the #2 headband, who must fend it off while he reaches the mountain. And so Afro Samurai follows the life of a man who is only referred to as Afro, who at a young age witnesses his father, the owner of the #1 headband, being brutally killed by a gunslinger named Justice. And so, as an adult, Afro sets off to attain the #2 headband in order to kill Justice and avenge his father. So, on its surface level, Afro Samurai is just a plain revenge story, if you want to view it that way. But if you want to peel it back, there's a lot more layers to actually what went on. And so, characterization. So, while Afro's personality and demeanor take influence from traditional Bushido culture, his aesthetic and design borrow heavily from African American culture. So Afro's demeanor is basically a post-apocalyptic take on a Ronin. He lives by his own code and morals, and he obeys no master. And Afro isn't necessarily a bad man, but he has no qualms doing bad stuff if it means it's going to get him closer to his end goal. So he won't go out of his way to hurt people, but it won't stop him. Violence won't stop him, essentially. And so, while his personality reflects Japan, his whole look and aesthetic represents African Americans. His trademark afro is something you would not commonly associate with Japanese or Bushido culture. It's something you would associate with African Americans, obviously. And so that right there, basically, I think shows that Afro Samurai himself is representing a fusion of kind of African Americans and Japan. And there's also the fact it's very alluded that Afro and his father were foreigners in a lost land, and I attributed that to slavery in general. And so music production. And so when creating the soundtrack, the RZA wanted to tell an entirely different story from a whole new perspective when coming into the project. He loved everything about it, but thought that he could bring something more to it by doing this. And so he flew out to Japan, met the creator, and he spent a few days just brainstorming how the soundtrack could bring everything to life. And so eventually, apparently in a meeting, he had this fantastic idea where he was going to tell the story of African American music up from the Soul era to modern day. And so, in the RZA's mind, Rokutaro, Afro's father, represented the old school soul era of African American culture. And we don't really see much of the father, but you see his only soundtrack when he's there is a soul tune, and it's very much indicative. Justice, the main enemy, represents kind of the era of hard rock and metal, which is what came in and ended soul to the RZA. And so whenever you see Justice, you usually hear like very heavy guitar and just metal influence all around. And then you have Afro. And Afro basically goes on in his life to incorporate ideas from both his father and Justice in his lifestyle. And so to RZA, that metaphorically represented the birth of hip-hop, which was a combination of kind of all blends of music. So I thought this was super interesting because I think it kind of calls back to the point I was making earlier, where if you're not from Japan, you're going to view anime and sort of with a new perspective and be able to tell your own story with it. So here's just a short clip from a documentary about the production of the show, and it just kind of talks about RZA's philosophy when he's making the music.
I'm a super fan of martial arts films and samurai films, so I've watched so many of them. So I try to also emulate some of the classic styles of the old composers from Asia. A lot of taiko drums and percussions also is used throughout the series. Martial art and horror, I would say, specialized with stabs. And so you will have a lot of different stabs going on inside this too, because that to me is the real uniqueness of those kind of films.
Afro Samurai is the project where East and Western culture can get together. And he intends his music to be a symbol of such fusion.
We go to the studio today, my man Taleb is in the joint, you know what I mean? It's kind of cool that he's here throwing a verse. Taleb was part of a group called Black Star with Mos Def and Talib Kweli, right? And the director and creator of Afro Samurai, who we call Bob, he is a fan of Mos Def and Talib, and when he heard he was getting a Talib verse involved with the Afro Samurai project, he was excited about that. So this is, I think, a good day for Afro Samurai.
I talk smack and I kick punch lines. Sometimes the lights go out. It's dark like I took a stab at the sunshine.
Afro Samurai blends hip hop and samurai culture and martial arts. Nothing in animation has been done to this magnitude, you know what I mean? So this is going to be a good milestone for hip hop and animation, you know what I mean? Music in general. It's like this is all top quality animation. But what makes Afro Samurai a little special is that we got this blend of culture. Thank you for enjoying or watching the show and enjoying it. Hopefully, I may catch you in the future. Afro Samurai. Keep your sword sharp, alright?
Alright. So, in conclusion, the most striking conclusion that I found was how, what the RZA was explaining, how this fusion of cultures came together. And so I think it's just super fascinating how, even though anime was never really meant for an American audience, it's always Japanese creators usually go out with the intent to create it for Japanese audiences. I just find it amazing that people can resonate with characters in totally different ways that were never intended by the author. And so to close it out, I thought I would just play my favorite clip from the show, which just features classic Samuel Jackson. Thank you for listening.
He's into the fucking chicken. What? Hey, wait! It's too early! Whoa! Hey! Can you give a brother a break, yo? Can't you see the man's down? What about iron and fairness and shit? RPG? You got a motherfucking RPG? A RPG in a motherfucking backpack? Wait, you talking about this? You ain't gonna monologue and I can get a bag after me?